Thanks again for listening, and join us in building up the kingdom by sharing Pod Apostle with a friend.
So in this week's gospel, Jesus commands us, not once, not twice, but 3 times. He commands us to love. I command you. This I command you. This is my commandment to you, that we love one another. But then how? What further description? Love one another as I love you. Now we, human beings, we rational animals, we are made in the image and likeness of God. There are things about us that are like God. And a couple of those things, or maybe 3 of those things, is that we have an intellect. We have our intellect, we have the capacity to reason. As I said a moment ago, we are the rational animal. And our ability to reason and think and have insight and understandings, that's one of the ways we are made like God. Another way we are made like God is our passions, our emotions, our capacity to really form bonds and emotional bonds. That is elevated in us. It's a greater capacity that we have than lower animals. And the third way is in our will, that we have the capacity to choose. We don't operate essentially by instinct as much as we operate by rational choice. We choose. And in each of these ways we are capable of loving. But the way that we are most capable of loving is by our choice. We often talk about falling in love and falling out of love. That's not necessarily the highest form of love. It is the decision to love. It is the decision, the capacity to give of ourselves. We live in a world right now that has radically undermined or cheapened the notion of what love is. But Jesus Christ shows us the highest form of love. He teaches us about love, and then he gives us a visual aid to his love, right? And what is the visual aid that he gives us? And then he invites us here, and he says, and I will say on his behalf in a few moments, this is my body given up for you. This is my blood poured out for you. We are commanded by Jesus to love. And is it even reasonable for Jesus to command us to have warm and fuzzy feelings towards people? When he says we're even supposed to love our enemies, we're supposed to have warm and fuzzy feelings toward them. No, that's not reasonable even. But to love them, to desire their good. I read a book a few years ago. The name of the book was The Road Less Traveled, by a guy named M. Scott Peck. He was a medical doctor, a psychiatrist. And he wrote this book, and then he went on, he became pretty famous, and then he wrote some other things. And he realized in his medical practice that a lot of the people's neurosis and psychosis had to do with their inability to love or be loved or experience love or problems in their lives. And he came up with a kind of simple definition of love. And that definition resonated with me when I read it. And it was this: the ability to extend one's self for the good of another. To extend ourselves for the good of another. Now, what would we, maybe as Christians, what word could we substitute for extend oneself? Sacrifice. Jesus says, love one another as I have what? Loved you. And how did he love us? No greater love than to do what? Lay down your life. And you know what, brothers and sisters? We're not even capable of love. except that God has loved us first. And so I say to you, first and foremost tonight, I say, let God love you. Let him love you. Let his love into your soul, so that as it dwells into your soul, you know what it means to be loved by God. And then you hear the commandment of Jesus, now love one another as I have loved you. And so the first step is receiving God's love. It was not you who chose me, Jesus says, but I who chose you. There is written in the human heart a desire for love. God made man and put in him this desire. This desire are the bands by which God draws man to himself. Only in love and only in the love of God are the deepest desires of man realized. That's from the Catechism, chapter 27. I once met a bright and unhappy young man who told me with conviction that there is no God. Jeff was both unhappy and irritated when he told me this. He was irritated because he was, quote, surrounded by crazy people. And he was unhappy because, well, he was unhappy. As I listened to him, I learned from him that he had been raised by nannies. His mom was a workaholic. She was an attorney and a successful attorney. He had been abandoned by his father. He had a hard life, but he had always had money. Like so many people, he was infected with an epidemic of poverty. He had plenty of stuff, but there is no worse poverty than being unloved. Jeff had been in and out of trouble with drugs and petty crime, but now he was in his early 20s and he had a girlfriend, and he really liked her. He no longer had much money, but he did have a job, and he was generally getting his life back on order, doing pretty well for himself. But he was distressed because it was his girlfriend who brought him to this place where he was surrounded by crazy people. According to Jeff, they were crazy because they believed in God, and they were happy about it. God and his rules. What is there to be happy about in that? He positively did not believe in God. I asked him to consider the consequences of his conviction that there is no God. If life is an accident, a random series of atoms bumping into each other, then everything, from the Big Bang to your mom and dad hooking up, are in the end meaningless. And your father who abandoned you and your mom for somebody else, he never did anything wrong. And if evolution is the rule, he actually did something right by furthering his genetic line and getting around to spread his seed. He accepted these things. Life is meaningless. Actions are morally empty. He forgave his father. He embraced the fact that he was an accident of evolution without issue. I was surprised when he even shook off his melancholy for a moment to enthusiastically go into detail about how the light that people see in a near-death experience is nothing to do with God. It's just the brain shutting down. So he told me it had been proven. He was energized further to explain to me that Christians are crazy, that is insane, because they don't live in the real world, and they have made up this God to ease their fear and control other people. This was our conversation. And I asked Jeff to consider that if there is no God, then in the end, there is no love. His acceptance of my premises stopped cold. He twisted his face into a disappointed look, and he protested, and he declared to me, there is love, but there is no God. Again, I pointed out that if he was an accident of evolution, love is simply an evolutionary tool, a chemical reaction in the unfolding of life and life. And if that's love, it's not the love you crave. If one can pick up the dust of the earth and say, this is my great-grandfather, If someone can look at the rocks out there in the asteroid belt and say, that's all I am, a complex protein, nothing more than an ant or an amoeba, just kind of further along, then where's the love? There's no love in the primordial soup. The lovelessness of a godless universe is not often talked about by people who reject God. But those who are mature and honest have to acknowledge that there is no love between amoebas. Some have acknowledged that we, in a simply material universe, it's ultimately loveless, and that if all we are is dust, and that we will return to dust, there can be no love. I related to Jeff an idea that I had heard from a committed atheist. He said, self-giving, love, self-sacrifice, altruism, if such things are even possible, they are an evolutionary defect in the individual that is good for the whole community. This logically follows from the fatherhood of rocks and dust. If there is no God, then we are just a random collection of atoms, complex proteins, cells, viruses, minerals, in the extended family with, like I said, rocks and amoebas, jellyfish, ants, and trees. So where's the love? But if there is a spiritual reality, if there is a spiritual power, doesn't that open the door to the possibility of God? This intelligent and miserable young man understood my point, but he protested and surprised me with his tears. Having lost the brightness that he flickered when explaining death to me, he kept saying, there is love, there is love, there is love. And I said, yes, Jeff, God is love. The good news is, no matter how the earth formed, there is love. And we know it instinctively because God put it in us. In the end, to deny God is the beginning of a denial of love. And a world without love, and the fruit of love is relationship, and a world without love and a world without relationship, that is the very definition of hell. The good news is there is love, and God is love, and He loves us, and He commands us, right? Love one another as I have loved you. Mother Teresa said, the most terrible loneliness and the greatest poverty is the feeling of being unloved. But God is love, and He loves you, and He loves me. And so we receive His command tonight to love one another.